Thank you for being here again, many of you, to worship God, and we're so grateful. May this be a blessing to you, because we know by giving God our very best tonight, it certainly is something that blesses Him and what He wants and desires. And Don, you're not alone in overlooking sometimes a prayer for our pregnant women, and they are so important. And so may we continue to do that, and thank you, Don, for reminding us and setting us a good example tonight. Well, with that, I'm going to continue tonight our study of a man that stubbornly refused to take advantage, and I mean that in a positive way, of God's mercy. Incredible mercy. That's, of course, King Ahab of the Old Testament. Despite the fact that God gave him opportunity after opportunity, chance after chance to repent, to change his heart, he failed. Failed badly. And it ended up, and we'll eventually see this in a few Sunday nights from now, that it cost him everything. So we're going to pick up the story tonight in 1 Kings chapter 20. But let me do a very rapid review to catch us up. In an effort to change Ahab's idolatrous heart, God repeatedly demonstrated that the Lord is God. God is the only Lord, Jehovah God. And so he showed up the false god Baal during the battle of the gods on Mount Carmel. In addition, God answered Elijah the prophet's prayer to bring the 3.5-year drought to an abrupt end. And God brought a lot of rain that very first day, in fact. Moreover, if that didn't impress or should not have impressed him enough, God granted Ahab 2 inconceivably one-sided victories over the far superior forces of King Ben-Hadad of Syria. In fact, to ensure that King Ahab knew that God was behind the victories, he sent a prophet to Ahab prior to each of those battles. In fact, let's pick up in 1 Kings chapter 20 and verse 28. We just covered this near the end of that lesson. Last lesson, that was 2 weeks ago tonight, because we had different lessons over the Memorial Day weekend. 1 Kings 20, verse 28. This is just prior to that second battle. Then a man of God came and spoke to the king of Israel and said, "Thus says the Lord, because the Syrians have said, 'The Lord is God of the hills, but He is not God of the valleys.'" That was their theory as to why the Syrian army was routed during the first battle. All right? "Therefore," God says through the prophet to Ahab, "I will deliver all this great multitude into your hand." In other words, I won't let anyone escape. The idea being, neither should you, Ahab. I'll get them all under your control. Now you take them. In fact, God intended that Ahab and his army, his small army, kill every single one of the enemy army. Now, we may question that sometimes. Why would God have them do that? Believe you me, God had His reasons. And one of the most common reasons that God wanted the enemies utterly destroyed, killed, was because He knew that even if just a few were left alive, eventually, it's not so much that they'd come back to get revenge, it's that they would influence Israel in the wrong direction, which frequently happened, by the way. So God had good reasons. And then He says, "And you shall know after this next battle, after this next rout, you shall know that I am the Lord." This victory will just prove it again. Now, everything happened just exactly as the prophet predicted, except for one thing. Now, I'm picking up at verse 29. "And the two armies, encamped opposite each other for 7 days. So it was, on the 7th day, the battle was joined. And the children of Israel killed 100,000 foot soldiers of the Syrians in 1 day." And notice what it does say. But we can certainly imply from this, not one in Israel, in their army, was killed, apparently. Or it would have mentioned that, because typically it did. It would mention casualties of Israel, but not one is mentioned here. All right? But this wasn't all the army of Syria, but the rest fled to Aphek into the city. And they thought they'd be safe there. And as I said a couple weeks ago, this is really amazing. Then a wall fell on 27,000 of the men. So they were all gathered near this huge wall in the city, and it fell on the men who were left. So apparently they were all wiped out instantly. And Ben-Hadad fled and went into the city, into an inner chamber. So he just, it's like a storm shelter. He's just trying to find the safest place in the city he could find, where hopefully nobody would find him, or if they did, it'd take him quite a while to do so. Then his servants said to him, because he had a few left with him, "Look now, we have heard that the kings of the house of Israel are merciful kings." And that, for the most part, was true. "Please let us put sackcloth around our waist and ropes around our heads." Again, this symbolized their subjugation. "And go out to the king of Israel. Perhaps he'll spare your life." Verse 32. So they wore sackcloth around their waist and put robes around their heads and came to the king of Israel and said, and notice the wording, "Your servant." Your servant, Ben-Hadad. Just a little while ago, your arch enemy, well, no longer. Your servant. And the Hebrew word here can also be translated your slave. Your slave. Ben-Hadad says, and he uses that very powerful word, even in the Hebrew language, please, please, please let me live. And he, Ahab, said, what should he have said? No way. God told the prophet what to tell me, and I'm going to carry it through. No. He says, is he still alive? And this is just insane. He says, he is my brother. Brother? Brother? In what way was King Ahab, or King Ben-Hadad related to Ahab? Folks, there's no relation other than the fact they're both part of the human race. And if there was any distant relation, they'd probably have to go back 1,000 years maybe to find it. Folks, I've studied this. The only way I can say that they were related was that they were both idol worshipers to the extreme. In that respect, yes, they could be brothers, I suppose. All right, verse 33. Now the men were watching closely to see whether any sign of mercy would come from him. So they're watching his face. They're going to see if he's angry. And based on what he said, it sounds good to them. And they quickly grasped at his word and said, like it's yeah, your brother. Yes, your brother. Ben-Hadad. Notice they don't even call him the king. Your brother. Sounds great to us. So he, Ahab, said, go, bring him. And of course they go to tell Ben-Hadad, I won't even call him a king at this point, came out to him, and he, Ahab, had him. Now this is just astounding. It's even worse than calling him brother. He has him come into his chariot. He's coming into the king's chariot, the royal chariot. Now that was an honor, by the way, typically bestowed to a war hero. And he's letting his arch enemy now come and stand, sit, whatever, in that chariot with him. And, okay, verse 34. So Ben-Hadad said to him, and Ben-Hadad, I'm sure, just astounded. He can't believe this. Like, how is this happening? I mean, he's delighted. So he's a little suspicious. Maybe this is just a temporary thing. So he's going to try to ensure his survival. So he said to Ahab, the cities which my father took from your father, I will restore. I'll give back that territory. And it's like I'm just sure he's just tripping over himself trying to be cooperative, helpful, suggesting a peace treaty. And you may set up marketplaces for yourself in Damascus. That's our idolatrous capital, by the way. Great place to sell things from. As my father did in Samaria. Now that was almost a low blow. You see, we took you before, so we set up our marketplaces in your area. But tell you what, fair is fair. We'll let you set up marketplaces now in our capital city. Then Ahab said, no way. No, he said, I'll send you on your way. In other words, I'll let you go with this treaty. I like this. So he made a treaty with him and sent him away. Do you know that was like shaking hands with the devil? It really was. I mean, God is so upset about what is transpiring here. Ahab, first of all, disobeyed by sparing what we would call a satanic king. Number two, Ahab makes a treaty with him, an agreement that he's going to let him live. And he's not going to bother him in this treaty. Do you know, that'd be like the church. Seriously, think about this. Just how ridiculous this whole thing was. It'd be like the church making an agreement with an abortion clinic. And saying, tell you what, we won't protest, we won't picket you. If you'll agree to let us, if we have a woman that insists on abortion, to let us, that she will go first in line. What do you say about that? God forbid anything like that. But what was happening here, what Ahab agreed to. And this is how, listen, this is how Ahab thanks God for the victory. Why would Ahab do such a thing? Especially after the victory. Folks, one reason I can come up with, Ahab somehow in his own mind, a legend in his own mind, thought that he was responsible for the victory, not God. Somehow convinced, it was really my expertise. It was really my power, my strategy. Thus, thinking that, he'd think, well, I have the right to do whatever I want to spare anyone, to make any treaty. And you talk about abusing, just exploiting God's mercy. And that's what he was doing. So God, as you'll see, basically responded this way. All right? That's the way you want it? You're making up your bed, Ahab. I hope you're ready to sleep there. Because you will. Literally. Or beyond literally, I guess, when we say sleep. We'll see that a little later on. But let's go into verse 35. This is a very intriguing incident now. Now, a certain man of the sons of the prophets, which means he was from a family of prophets, he was a prophet himself, as you'll see, said to his neighbor by the word of the Lord. So God gives him a command to say something. So he tells his neighbor, who knows him and should have known he was a prophet, strike me, please. Strike me? Now, what would you have done? Well, bear in mind, if a man is a prophet, and you know he speaks for God, and you know whatever he's asking, it's ultimately God asking, you'd better do it. How strange the request may be. And the man refused to strike him. So that was tantamount to saying no to God. Which, a little lesson here. Not everything God commands us to do is easy. And some things God commands us to do may not seem to make sense in our minds. Speaking of striking a person, let me just read to you a command Jesus gave. I'm reading from Luke 6:29 and Matthew 5:39, same thing. Jesus said, to him who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other. Turn the other cheek. Offer that to him. By the way, have you ever done that? Very few have. But if you ever had that opportunity where somebody just for whatever reason just hauled off and slapped you or smacked you or struck you, how many of us would remember this? I've never had that happen. I had one similar experience in high school. We were playing intramural basketball. I was not good enough to make the regular team, but I wasn't good enough for a lot of things back then. Intramural basketball, and I just harassed our opponents, to no end. Nobody on the opposing teams really liked me after the games. I screamed when they were trying to shoot, everything but free throws, because I got thrown out of one game for screaming that time. Anyway, all right, so anyway, after the game, one of the opposing players, this is a big guy, he's about 6'3", he comes up to me, and I'm walking by some lockers, and just out of nowhere, he just shoves me into this set of lockers. Now, these weren't lockers that were freestanding, so they're against the wall. So someone shoves you against one of those lockers, you come to an abrupt stop. Well, I look surprised, and I turn the other, whatever. Well, he shoves me again. And I come back to him, and he shoves me a third time. I guess in a sense you might say I turned the cheek twice, but let me say it's only because he was 6'3", 6'4", and I was about 5'10" at the time. But seriously, once he realized I was not going to retaliate, he walked off in a huff, but the next day in school, he caught me in the cafeteria, and I thought, oh, here we go again. He hugged me and apologized profusely. He said, I was such a fool. He said, I was mad. My parents have told me the only time I ever get in trouble is when I'm mad, and I did that. And he said, this is not a Christian to my knowledge at that point in time. He said, would you please forgive me? And we became close friends after that. Well, anyway, there's something to that turning the other cheek. But all right, so let's go on to verse 36 now. All right. Then he, the prophet, said to the man who would not strike him, because you have not obeyed the voice of the Lord, surely, as soon as you depart from me, a lion shall kill you. Does that sound familiar? Any ever remember a story like that before? Well, we read about it some time ago, 1 Kings 13:24. Remember the prophet, the man of God, that God sent to Jeroboam and predicted against the altar, the idolatrous altar, and the altar would be split and all the ashes fell out, and that happened. And then as this prophet was going home, because he was not to stay there, not to eat, he was going home, another older prophet encountered him, and he lied to him because he wanted him to come to his house, and he went and he ate, and soon he got killed by a lion, which just reminds me, God can control, not that he always does, but God can control animals. I find that fascinating, even lions. All right. So as soon as he left him, this neighbor, a lion, found him and killed him. Verse 37. And he found another man. And I don't know if this man knew what had happened earlier, but he says to the other man, strike me, please. And maybe he had heard. But anyway, so the man struck him. And there was no malice here, no malice at all. It's simply obeying what the prophet told him to do. Inflicting a wound. So that either there was blood or an eye that started blackening. I'm thinking maybe it was an eye based on how this prophet will disguise himself. And this is all God's plan for all this to happen. Then the prophet departed and waited for the king, Ahab, by the road, and disguised himself with a bandage over his eyes. So Ahab knew this prophet, but God wanted something to happen before his identity was revealed. Now, as the king passed by, he, the prophet, cried out to the king and said, now listen, this is important. God says lying is wrong. You shall not bear false witness. And when you read this, you'd think, well, he was lying. Well, no, he was telling a story. He was actually telling a parable related to a real-life event, a big battle that has just happened. So here's what he says to the king, and of course he's shouting out to the king as the king's riding by. He says, your servant, so he gets his attention, went out into the midst of the battle, and there a man came over and brought a man to me, presumably one of the enemy, captured soldier, and said, guard this man, if by any means, guard this man, and if by any means he is missing, in other words, if he gets away from you, your life shall be for his life, or else you shall pay a talent of silver. And this really shows it to be more of a story, because a talent of silver is 6,000 denarii, which is equivalent to 20 years' wages, typical wages, which would be impossible for most people, except very wealthy, to pay, all right? So in other words, if this man gets away from you, you're going to either pay a talent or you're going to die, all right? So he continues, while your servant was busy here and there, distracted, whatever, he was gone. Wow, slipped through my fingers. And all the while, there's an implied question. It's kind of like the prophet disguised is saying to the king, so hey, what do you say about this? What would be fair? Almost like, can I get out of this somehow? Then the king of Israel said to him, so shall your judgment be. You yourself have decided it. By your own words, you've made the decision. I mean, if you've got a tail to sell, fine. If not, you die. And it's interesting. It says, and the prophet hastened to take off the bandage. Why would he take it off so quickly? Probably because King Ahab didn't realize this is just a parable story. He thought it was real, so he probably was getting ready to order the immediate execution of this prophet. So I think the prophet kind of saw what was coming. So he took off his bandage away from his eyes, and the king of Israel recognized him as one of the prophets. And poor Ahab, now he's confused. Then he, the prophet, said to him, Ahab, thus says the Lord, because you. Now listen, this so reminds me of 2 Samuel chapter 12, when Nathan the prophet went to David to expose his adulterous relationship and his murder, as it were, on the battlefield of Bathsheba's husband Uriah the Hittite. And he tells him this story, King David the story about this man who was so poor, and his neighbor basically killed his little lamb, and what should happen? And David said, well, that man should be killed for doing that, in essence. And Nathan pointed at David and says, you're the man. You're guilty. And that's exactly what this prophet is saying to King Ahab. Because you have let slip out of your hand a man, speaking for God, whom I appointed to utter destruction. I wanted this man dead. In fact, of all those in the army, God wanted most of all King Ben-Hadad to die, because his influence, if allowed to continue, would be a curse. And it actually was. Therefore, your life shall go for his life. Okay, Ahab, you spared him. You'll die now. But what's worse, he says, and your people for his people. In other words, Israel is going to pay a price for this too. And they will. So the king of Israel, now he knows this man's a prophet. So what's he do? So the king of Israel repented? Did he apologize, beg for mercy? Did he say, you know what? I will chase down King Ben-Hadad and I'll kill him? No. He went to his house sullen, which means the word sulking comes to mind. So he goes to his house sulking and displeased. Not at himself, but at God. He just didn't like what God had to say, and he came to Samaria, his capital city. Now, we're going to stop the story here. We'll continue next Sunday night, God willing. But I tell you what, it's hard for me to conceive of anyone being as stubborn as King Ahab, as hard-hearted, resistant to change. And it's almost like God was saying, okay, this is an opportunity right here. Even when God through the prophet said, your life or his, since mercy didn't work, I think God was saying, well, maybe the promise of death will work. Maybe now I can get through that thick heart of yours. But no. Not for a man whose heart was as hard as stone, reminiscent of Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And as we'll see next week, instead of changing, Ahab just gets worse, especially with the help of Jezebel, his wife. So what can we take away from these thoughts tonight? I think 4 things. Number 1, if a prophet ever asks you to slap him, slap him. Well, don't ever refuse God's commands. Listen, the Bible, and specifically the commands of God, is not a buffet where you just pick and choose and, I'll leave that, but I'll take this. Years ago, I got pretty serious into Weight Watchers. I don't know if it's the exact same today, because Brenda's been in that, maybe some. But there was one hard and fast rule, this goes back 10 years or more, that it goes by points, and you assign points to everything you're going to eat based on the fat and the fiber and all this sugar, whatever. But one thing they stressed Now, when you determine what your meal is to be based on your points, don't eat any less. And that was very, very strict. Don't eat everything. Fulfill your points. And there were times I thought, well, I don't feel as hungry today, so I won't quite eat all this, or I'll just push that one aside. And I was defeating the whole plan, because the plan basically was structured to say, if you don't eat exactly what you're supposed to eat, if you eat a little less thinking, oh, I can cheat in a positive way, then you're going to wake up at midnight hungry. And you're going to cheat, which I did. Well, that's like God's command. You just do what God says. In Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 22, God says, you shall therefore keep all my statutes and all my judgments and perform them. In the New Testament, in 1 John chapter 2, beginning at verse 3, and this is also found in chapter 5, 1 John 2, 3 and following. Now, by this we know that we know him, that is truly know God, if we keep his commandments. He who says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. Now what that means is if you treat the commandments of God like a buffet and keep only what you want to keep, but this is inconvenient, so I'll just push that aside. You do not love God no matter how much you claim to. And continuing, but whoever keeps his word, all of it, truly the love of God is perfected in him. By this we know that we are in him. And most of you remember, and I love the words of Solomon in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. This is man's all. Keep God's commands. Number 2, do not shake hands with the devil. What I mean by that is be very careful about your associations. What King Ahab did in making that treaty would come back to haunt the whole nation. In 1 Corinthians 5, verse 6, Paul said, do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? You may say, well, this person, this place, that place, not all that bad. Listen, you're exposed to someone long enough. The bad tends to have more influence than the good person on the bad. Now, if you're sitting down in a serious Bible study with a person, there may be a chance. But if you're just in constant association with a person, it can hurt you. 1 Corinthians 15:33, do not be deceived. Evil company corrupts good habits, good morals. And you're familiar with what Paul told the Corinthians, because they had a lot of trouble with their associations. 2 Corinthians 6:14 and following, do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial? What part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? And he goes on. Thank you for listening to this lesson. Thank you for being here to glorify our Father in heaven and learn from these stories things that we can learn and need to keep learning all the time. If anyone needs to respond to the invitation, please, while we're standing and singing, come up and have a seat and we'll help you. If you need to, would you come as we do stand right now and sing together?